On to our next primitive value. So we've talked about numbers. Next up, we have Booleans. Now, Booleans are very simple. We have two options for a Boolean value, true or false. That's it. So Booleans are used to store yes or no values, a true or false value. That's really all there is to it. And we actually write the word true and the word false. So these are special words in JavaScript. You'll notice if I go to my console and I just type, I don't know, if I type truth, that gives me an error. If I type fish, that gives me an error. But if I type true, different color, and I don't get an error, I get the exact same result that I do when I type a number. Well, it's not the same result, but the same sort of feedback. It just prints it back out to me. It's telling me, this is JavaScript or the console's way of telling me, I recognize that, you're allowed to do that. Versus typing something else, I get an error. So true and false, two special values in JavaScript. And later on, we'll see how we use these, how these play a very important role in performing logic and having our code have different outcomes and making decisions and all that really important stuff. But at their core, Booleans are very, very simple, just true or false values. So even though they're very simple, they're used a lot. If you think of in a typical application, just how many things you could store as true or false values. Things like if you're making a game, is the game still playing? Or has the person won or have they lost? So we can store them in a variable just like anything else that we've seen, a number, for example. I could do let is active game, for example, equals true. And then at some point that might be false. So is active game is true, but I could save it or set it to be false instead. Notice true and false are lowercase. If I do true like that, I get an error. In other languages, like Python, for example, they are uppercase, but this is not Python, it's JavaScript. Other use cases, things like let is logged in. For a website, that's a very important thing you might want to keep track of. And you could do that using a variable where you would change it from true to false or false to true. So you could replicate this functionality, right? You could do something like let is game over and use 1 and 0 maybe, and just switch from 1 to 0 and 0 to 1, and you would just have to know which one is true, which one is false. But using a Boolean makes that way, way simpler. It's built into JavaScript, yes or no values, very straightforward, at least so far. So it's another primitive type. We've seen numbers, we've seen Booleans, and this leads me to the next topic, very quick one, which is in JavaScript, we can have a variable, a single variable that changes type. If we make a numeric variable, it is not stuck storing a number forever. We could make it store a Boolean. So I have is logged in right here, which stores a Boolean right now. I could, if I wanted to, change that to a number. It's an odd choice. It doesn't really make sense. And it's pretty rare that you would do something like this, if ever, but you can in JavaScript. And I just want to highlight that. In some other programming languages, it's common that when you make a variable, if it's a number that you're storing, that variable can only ever store a number. Or if we make a Boolean, that variable can only ever store a Boolean value. And it kind of makes sense. A Boolean is very, very easy to store, right? You can store a yes or no, a true or false value with just a 1 or a 0, a single bit, versus a number could take a lot more space. So that's all I want to say there. In JavaScript, you can have a variable that changes type. It's not a big deal. It's not going to yell at you. There is something called TypeScript, which you may have come across or you may have heard about. It's sort of like an add-on or a fancier version of JavaScript that does enforce those sort of type restrictions, where a variable, if you declare it as a number variable, must remain and always store a number instead of a Boolean or something else. But on its own, regular old JavaScript does not have any restrictions like that. So to recap, Booleans, another primitive type, true or false, that's all there is to them. Very simple. We can store them in a variable just like we can store numbers or strings, which we're about to learn about.